What are we living for? To rent an apartment on the second floor. No money coming in. Rent collectors knocking, trying to get in. We are strictly second class. We don't stand a chance. Good day. Welcome to Dumpster Times 28. I'm Wanda Duck, editor, publisher, and chief bottle washer. Horatio is here inside, and we will join him shortly. Right now, we're looking at the front yard and the steps, and this is as much snow as we've had so far, but it is very, very cold. So we're going to go back inside the dumpster and settle in next to the house plants for a little chat. See you shortly. All right, let's settle in and warm up and talk about what today is, a holiday. It is the day that we celebrate Martin Luther King Jr.'s birthday. And I'm here to talk a little bit about what I, as a white person, what I do on Martin Luther King Day. I'm not saying that all white people have to do what I do, but I am suggesting that you think about what you as a white person ought to be doing on Martin Luther King Day. There are many, many things you could be doing. So what I'm going to do is reflect upon my life and experience perceiving racism in my community. And I'm going to go way back to childhood in the 1950s. The first time I witnessed segregation in action. We lived in a rural area of Ohio, had moved there from the city because it was cheaper to buy land back then in the county I grew up in. Now it's all reversed, and that county has become a super suburban paradise for people who want mansions, mini McMansions, and their own little lake with their own little boat on it. But back then it was all farms and pretty much Republican conservative values. There was a lake, a swimming lake down the road from our house, and we used to go there. We lived there every summer. Got a summer pass, went swimming every day, took lessons. Well, one day I was riding up on my bike to the gate to get into the lake, and there was an old car pulled up at the gate, and people were leaning out the window trying to pay. They had some money in their hands to get in. The only problem was they were Black people. And the man at the gate told them they could not enter and they had to go away. They weren't allowed to swim there. Another experience I had of racism in action was with one of the elders in our family. That's right. We had a severely racist infected elder who could not cope with being in close proximity with Black people, and it was sick. I remember as a little girl trying to explain to this relative, oh, dear relative, look at our mama cat. She's a tiger. Look at the little kittens she had. There's a white one, there's a black one, there's a yellow one, there's another tiger one. But you know what? No matter what color they are, they're all kittens. And that's the way humans are. As I grew older, I began to see it as some kind of brain infection because reason could not permeate that attitude. Another experience of racism I had with this relative was one summer, we had another relative come from overseas, and this elder relative decided to take me and my other elder relative on a weekend trip to Niagara Falls. And we were going to stay over in a hotel and see the sights and experience the falls. It would be delightful. So we drove all day to get to the falls, and he was so intent on getting there that we didn't even stop for dinner. So by the time we got there, we were very hungry and decided to pull over at a hamburger stand near the falls And we all got out and went up to the stand. And there, behind the counter, was a sweet young girl who happened to be African American. He pulled us back to the car, turned the car around, and drove all the way back to Akron without stopping anywhere. I was sobbing. The other elder relative was bewildered, didn't know what was happening. And my other relative, the one who was behind the wheel, was just steaming all the way home because he almost had an encounter with a person of a different race. My parents wanted to make sure that their children did not grow up with the attitudes of the elders in our family. Now, we were living in a conservative rural area. They would drive us into the city every weekend for events. I took art classes at the art museum, and the classes were filled with kids of all races. We watched all of the Martin Luther King Jr. speeches on TV and talked about them. I remember vividly sitting with my parents and listening intently and being profoundly moved by the March on Washington. And as I grew older, I was like an anomaly in our little county of white people, a school. There were no Black people in my school. There was, at one point, a servant had a servant working for a rich family in this area, and they sent the child, who was Black, to the local elementary school, and the kid was mercilessly bullied and had to be withdrawn. This was the 50s and 60s where I grew up. When I got to college in 1969, for the first time, I had an opportunity to really connect with people of different races. There was a young man in the theater department who was a grad student, and I just loved him. He was super talented and super cool. Then one night, I found myself at a cast party in a room with this guy, and he was sobbing in my arms because he was gay and he was afraid the world would find out, and he was in love with someone else in the theater department. And that was my first experience of understanding what happens to people who are ostracized in a very personal way. I also had a friend in college who was in love with a young Black man. And speaking of ostracized, her whole family ostracized her. But she loved this boy, and she decided to leave her family, leave most of her friends, and go off and live with this guy. Nowadays, no big deal, right? But back then it was a huge deal. Later on in life, I became a school teacher, a public school teacher, and I had the ability to choose my own students. It was a public art school, and kids had to audition to get into the school. And it was set up as a magnet school so that it would attract people from all corners of the city, and thus equity and inclusion would be a part of it. Well, it wasn't really totally inclusive because kids with disabilities really weren't coming or being encouraged to apply. It's an old building. They didn't have the facilities for disability much. The other thing about it was, when I was looking to create my drama class each year from the kids who audition, I didn't want to end up with a class full of blonde, blue-eyed white girls. I really wanted diversity because you can't really tell wonderful stories about the world at large unless you have a diverse cast. So that's where I practiced my own form of, what's it called? That gave me opportunities to practice inclusive, diversified casting in the theater and inclusiveness in the classroom. And that's pretty much the way I've been ever since. Working with people who are different from you is such a great experience. You learn so much more. You become more open because you need to be, to absorb the differences, to find the connections. It's amazing. what doing a project with people who are very different from you, yet engaged in the same concept and the same idea, what that can do for everyone in the group. Because you're having points of view from all around, not just one point of view. And that is important if we're going to grow as people. So on this Martin Luther King Day, my suggestion is reflect upon your past. Think about incidents of racism you as a white person have witnessed. Think about how the people who were involved in that act of racism, how they felt. And then ask yourself, has it really changed? Have things changed? How have they changed? Have I, as a white person, changed? Am I doing more? Am I being better about my attitudes and about being inclusive and about reaching out instead of avoiding and hiding in fear? These are things that you can do as a white person. In honor of Martin Luther King Jr. Day, I would like to discuss briefly one story coming out of the state of Ohio, which recently had a new law passed by the state legislature, which severely restricted trans healthcare and eliminated trans women and trans men competing in sports. Now, this bill is completely based on ignorant thinking. Amazingly enough, our governor examined the science behind it all, talked to doctors, talked to the families, and talked to the people who were personally affected by this, many of whom said they will be moving out of Ohio if this bill goes through, because the health of their child is more important than staying in Ohio. Well, the governor agreed with them and overrode the bill. Last week, the House overrode his veto, and now we're waiting on the Senate to do the same. I wrote a letter to my state senator, a Republican who I have no connection with. She just was foisted on me. And I would like to share that letter with you now. Senator Christina D. Roebner, I'm writing to you as a retired educator and senior citizen residing in the state of Ohio. I am 72 years old. Throughout my life, I have encountered young people who grew up realizing that they were not at home with their assigned gender at birth. Their path is not an easy one, and we as citizens should do everything to support their journey. The state should not be interfering with families and their doctors. Perhaps you should really listen to the will of the people here in Ohio in terms of respecting individual liberty. As for trans women changing gender just so they can compete in women's sports, that is a fantasy promoted by a lot of right-wing males who have no comprehension of how testosterone works. A male transitioning to female takes drugs that lower testosterone, while a female transitioning to male increases testosterone. Funny how nobody talks about trans men competing in sports. The sexist assumption is that male bodies will always outcompete female bodies. The truth of the matter is that athletes of all genders differ from each other in terms of physical, chemical, and intellectual, emotional attributes. Testosterone levels differ across all women and all men. I would encourage you to actually speak to trans people and their families before taking this vote. Speak to doctors as well and understand the science. Somehow, I got gerrymandered into your district after having Democratic representation in the State House and Senate for decades. I am not happy, And I hope to vote this year on eliminating gerrymandering forever so that Ohio can once again become a fair and well-governed state. Sincerely, me. Sincerely, me. That's an action I took. There are actions that you can take when you see injustice. Whether or not my state senator will listen to me, who knows? But if she doesn't, well, she can rest assured that I will be doing everything in my power to help her opponent in the next election. Thank you very much. We'll see you next week for issue number 29. Until then, I'm Wanda Duck. Peace.